Testing, testing. Does it sound okay? Is it blurry?
Better.
Okay. Testing, testing. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay.
Good. My name's Tara Mancini. I have a blog called Calicos, Camelots, and Swords. The first two are textiles, and the last one's obvious. It's on a 17th century New York blog spot. I got involved with researching history because of a variety of reasons, but part of it is I accidentally stole one of my high school textbooks, and when I went back to look something up, I noticed there was, the book's like this thick, but there was this little paragraph on the first 50 years of New York history, and I'm like, oh, we're obviously not that important. You know, because as far as New York is concerned, the Pilgrims were our history. And I'm like, well, what did New York do? And it turns out there was Dutch people, and there was this whole early history. So my blog focuses on roughly 1600 to 1765, the end of the French and Indian War. And what I did was I compiled a database using the New York State Archives of over 100 inventories, probate inventories, shipping inventories, economics, so I can actually look for trends and things and how we were different. And there was something interesting that was turning up in there, something that wasn't made here and something that wasn't made in Europe. There's actually a lot of things. Oh, was it my computer decided to? Yeah. Oh, no. I think it shut off is what it was.
Okay, gotcha.
And there were some oddball things that were turning up. And they were, and we'll get into that for a minute, but this photo is actually a early 17th century Dutch photo. And the Dutch, they're the reason this stuff happens. And if you notice, they got mittens on. Now, knitting's been around for a long time, especially knitting in the round. Actually, the early Egyptians have knitted socks and things like this, and eventually the Europeans catch on to this. And the knitting was very common. Gloves, they were used for gloves. But what's interesting is that the Dutch start to become so wealthy, they begin tapping into their network for other people to make the supplies and then bring them into the Netherlands. And because the Dutch were the original settlers in New York, anything they got in Amsterdam was being shipped to their New York warehouses and then redistributed out through New York. Aha. So this gives us a rough idea of the Viking era. They come out of the Norway, and they spread in through various different areas, but they come over to Iceland, which is actually green, and then towards Greenland, which is icy, and then down to Newfoundland. And they're actually, you know, had they just made it a little bit further, they would have actually made it. But one of the interesting things about it is when we think of the Viking era, it's, as far as the continental Europe is concerned, it's, you know, that 900 to 1000 AD. It's very early on, and really that part doesn't have anything to do with New York. But they had colonies, and the colonies included Iceland and the Faroe Islands. And what happens is after the Vikings leave, they were pretty much isolated. And so you have these bubbles of Viking life trapped on Iceland and the Faroe Islands. This included a variety of tools. As technology was coming into Europe, Iceland and the Faroe Islands were not getting it. So they continued using the same technologies they've always done. So what ends up happening is the Faroe Islands, their Viking era, according to Viking historians, extends to the 14th century. And this is important because it's not until the 14th century where the Germans and the Dutch start to show up on their shores and saying, hey, you know, what do you have to trade? And the intercourse is very limited. They were not bringing in new technologies. So people like the Icelandic people were still using the same sheep that they had since the Viking era. And what's interesting about their sheep is you know, if you have a sheep, a modern sheep, you have to shear it. If you don't, you know, it can't shed its own wool. Theirs can. So technically they're domesticated, They still have dual coats. They have an outer coat and an undercoat, and a variety of different things. They're still eating, they still take their sharks after they catch them and stick them in the ground and ferment them, and that's how they eat, even today. So they managed to hang on to so much of their Viking culture. A lot of their foodways haven't changed, their sheep haven't changed, their wool industry hasn't changed for an extended period of time, right into the 17th century. And this is important because what starts to happen is the Dutch, they were so wealthy relative, this is, after the Middle Ages, but before the Enlightenment, they had so much wealth that the average person could afford meat in their diet every week. Just like a laboring person could afford this. A person at the laboring class could afford to get their laundry washed every week. So they didn't have a lot of people that wanted to come to America. It was too cozy there. So they started tapping into the Norwegians and various different Scandinavian people to start to come. So they start bringing in people like Lorenz and Berendt here, who come in, they start building mills, they start building factories, and they start planting plantations. So you have a people that really haven't changed, and it's interesting because they start sending ships up north to Newfoundland because they knew there was fish there. And so how exactly they understood that, they wanted their cod, they knew where to go get it, and they started sending ships up that way. So they seem to have, they brought a lot of their lifestyle, their old lifestyle with them. And the Norwegians and other Nordic descent people, they settled up by Albany and through the Hudson Valley, and not so much in New York City area, but then at the time it was New Amsterdam, but they also settled heavily in the Delaware region because that whole swath of land was one province at the time. So one of the, an interesting thing that started turning up in these inventories and court records and things like this is this thing called wadmal. Now, people on continental Europe in that area don't make this. This is something that's an old technology. It's an old fabric. It's actually something that the Vikings used. And the reason why they used it is because it's water resistant. So what we do is the upper one is, sometimes when it gets translated through languages, wadmal will turn up as kurzi. So what is that? Kurzi. It's the Norwegian kurzi right there, shows up in the inventory. And this was a Dutchman, he pulls this fabric out and he goes, I think this is a kurzi. And this was shipped with the Norwegians they picked up in Sweden. They came down, they were in Sweden, and they pick them up and they brought them to America to settle the colony. And they're like, there's this kurzi. And this is strange because the Dutch didn't make kurzi. So I'm sitting there going, where did this come from? Because the Dutch don't like kurzi. Kurzi is this cheap, coarse fabric. And he goes, but I figured that the thing about kurzi is it tends to be brushed and fulled. And so this had to be something related to another fabric. But also, I also found this, which is out of the Delaware area. Down in New Sweden, the governor started importing wadmal. And so there was likely some sort of connection. Here's more examples of primary sources where they needed to, the Dutch wanted to keep track of the products that were coming in, and they need to assess the valuation to them. So this is two more examples of them and the pricing. Stivers are kind of like a, sort of like a penny, and the guilders are roughly about $1. So they weren't cheap items. At this time, stuff was very valuable. And this is an example of what wadmal will look like. So you don't really see it being made, but it's more of a specialty item. But if you look close, what happens is it's woven, and then it's brushed or felted. And the fibers are water resistant, but this adds to the water resistance. Here's a couple children's mittens. These ones are from the Viking era. And the zigzag lines are because it's a twill fabric. And so as I started to turn up like all this information, trying to figure out exactly what this was turning up in 17th century New Netherland and New York, little bits started to come through. So what ended up happening was I ended up figuring out that wadmal, in the English call it wadmal with a W. It is a 2-2 twill. It was a type of fabric that the Vikings used to cover themselves. It was the only fabric capable of sustaining body temperature for them to travel the long distances they need to get from the Nordic countries out to Iceland. Without it, they couldn't have made it. Because it is water resistant. It's made from the long fibers of the sheep, and they would have froze to death otherwise without it, because they had very limited means of keeping themselves warm out there. Over time, once the wadmal was established on Iceland, different grades began to be developed. Greenland and Iceland kind of developed their own systems, and they brought the technology at the time. Most looms, if you notice, are kind of flat and they go out like this. That's not how they were making this. You know those Middle Ages looms that they got this big beam across the top and there's ropes hanging down and weights at the bottom? That's what they were making it on. And it's interesting because when they did archaeological digs, they found one. They've been finding the weights, but then finally one of the logs that they hung was found. And this was in around the 12th century. They were shown to still be doing it. And then this continued on right into the 14th and then on to the 17th century. It was being imported to Europe, but over time, once they get to like the late 17th century, early 18th century, it starts to become the fabric of the poor because it was very economical, it was affordable, and this was a major export for Iceland. There's one of the looms. This is from the Reykjavik Museum.
So they don't have any troubles?
Nope. I mean, this is literally old school, like, and this is what was being shipped to New Netherland in the 17th century. One of the interesting things, and it's actually, some of the stuff I'm talking about now is actually connected to underpants in the next talk, but there's these great letters written from the director that was up in the Rensselaer colony, which is near Albany. And one of the things he's talking about is we're having problems. New York is very humid. It's very muddy for extended periods of time. And this was exceedingly, and the loam, the farming, kind of like the soil, is deep. I mean, you could have 2 feet of it. So when it gets muddy, you're like, and he's talking about we need more clothing, we need more fabric because we cannot function in this environment. And we need more laundry people too, by the way. And so one of the things they were shipping was the wadmal to help them combat, that chill and the water. Just there was so much water that they were having to deal with the storms.
Excuse me, are those wamples, is that what you use to get the different threads for like a quilt yarn?
Yeah, from what I understand. I'm not a weaving expert. I tend to lean more towards the economics of things, but this was an oddity that turned up in the inventories and the shipping manifests.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You mentioned before that this is a European loom that they found. Is this the same?
No, it's an Icelandic loom.
I thought so, yeah. So before when you said European, was that a different type of loom?
So when the Vikings came, this is the loom that they brought with them.
Oh, I see.
And then when I was trying to, not everyone knows what a loom looks like, so I was trying to say European ones tend to be flat, horizontal, where the Vikings use a vertical loom, and then the Icelandic people just never stopped using it. I mean, obviously modern people don't use it, but
There are weights of black in this?
yes, these big stones.
Oh, I see.
See, they look like fishing weights. Yeah, and this is, it just hasn't changed. There's people still there that keep the tradition alive. But Iceland was not a place of money. You know, when the Germans, some Europeans kind of took turns. They established relationships. The Germans did for a period of time. The Danish did. And what they were looking for was the fabric and also their knitwear, and then also fish. And those are so low on the totem pole when it comes to economies that it wasn't like bringing in massive forms of money. So this was really more like they were sustaining themselves and they got a little extra money because in Iceland, their currency was this fabric. So if you wanted to go to the store and buy something, you rolled up your fabric, you took it to the store, you said, here's my fabric, I would like some cabbages, you know? And so at this time, during the Viking era, there was only one form of wadmal, okay? And you had to hit those standards. And the standards are set by the fabric, or the threads that run up and down, that's your warp. And the number of warps going across determine the quality of your fabric. And over time, I believe it's around the 15th century, after the 14th century, the reason why they cut off the Viking era in Iceland at the 14th century is because they start to export their wadmal to Europe. And so that's where the number of warps start to become important. And so Greenland and Iceland have, by the 15th century, have slightly different wadmals, but they're still wadmals. I see you typing away, so I just wanted to make sure you had it. On my blog, if you go to my blog, I have like this exceedingly long post, and it has all the primary sources in there for you. So I flew in from Europe the other day. I live in Luxembourg, and at some point between all that, I lost my entire presentation. I actually just put this together. And one of the problems I ran into is I could not, the sources for this, for things like the stockings that don't have copyright images, I could not get that source again. So I'm limited on what I can find. But if you go onto the internet and you type in like Icelandic stockings, you will get a lot of them. You just have to be careful because right in the 19th century, they started to change. And then mid-20th century, there was a big, if you start looking at their sweaters, there was this big shift in their, the way they designed. But so just be aware of that. So that's I believe it's around 10th to 12th century foot stocking. They're like moccasins, but this one is actually made out of wadmal. It's not knit, but it's the shape. So that's why I included that. So it's the cloth from the previous one, but it's the shape that you're looking for. They can also be very tall, and from what I was reading, the way that they worked is they would have had tall ones too. So they would have put on like their regular stockings, and then Icelandic stockings go over the top, and they're very tall, over the top of your regular stocking. So they would have been an overstocking. And there's two types of wool that comes off the sheep. There's the finer wool, and that's used for underwear in general. And then this other hair that's rougher, and that's where you hear the Faroe Island stockings, the Icelandic stockings. That's what they're using. It's coarse, and it's double the width of a normal stocking. And so they would put it on their first layer of woolens, and then they would entirely clad themselves from toe to head in this secondary, because it's the secondary one that's waterproof. This is a mitten, and they have two thumbs. No one quite knows why this started to happen. It happened so long ago. And if you notice there's slits, it's because this is a fisherman mitt, and at some point he's got to go out there. He needed a mitt that takes care of fishing, and then when he got to market, he can count coins. So he can get through and go, So, but you can tell this is an exceedingly thick mitten. These are just some extra data. I know I think we have a reenactor here. Reenactors, in order, when they want to do join groups or want to wear a certain outfit, they have to have proof, usually like two primary sources that something existed in order for them to include it into their outfits. So I wanted to make sure I provided enough evidence so no one can argue with them. But you can see that Icelandic stockings were being imported into New Netherland at this time. One of the things that does happen, it's like you have New Netherland, and New Netherland doesn't legally become New York until 1667. Everyone always hears 1664, but it's like the English landed them, but they didn't get legal control and no one respected it until 67. And this is important because what happens is all during this time, the Dutch controlled all the trade. And it's not until 1674, much like the first 3 quarters, the Dutch controlled all the trade in and out, even when it was New York, because the English merchants couldn't get a stronghold in there at all. In fact, they complained about this. So if you actually look at the trade coming into New York for the entirety of the 17th century, the English have, maybe a couple ships that show up. But because, I'm going to say New Yorkers because by then they were New Yorkers, a lot of New Yorkers owned their own ships. We had a lot of yachts. They were called yachts. Yachts are, at that time, were not fancy yachts. The goal of a yacht was as you had cannons along the side, they were fast, and they would run their shipments up and down the coast to meet up with the larger ships that were coming across the Atlantic. And the reason why they needed to do this was there was pirates, but also there was this thing called the Navigation Acts that the English wanted to tax everything, and so they had to be fast. And so New York had access to a lot of stuff that other colonies did not because they were just, like flying minnows. Go ahead.
Where are those pictures from?
The Reykjavik Museum. Sometimes they're not right off their site. People that go there and then upload it to Wiki Commons, and they have publicly available photos. Now, I did run into a problem where this is a Viking era mitten, and the Vikings used, and please forgive me because I'm not going to pronounce it quite right, it's nail botting. It's where you take a needle and you loop it around to, it's not technically a knit, but is like a knotting. And the Icelandic people continue to do this. And then it's believed that knitting the continental way everyone knows is introduced around the 15th century, but it seems to be a big gray zone on this area. And they have to keep digging and finding more archaeological digs. So exactly how these stockings were made that showed up in New Netherland we're not quite sure. Was it nail botting, mittens, and knitted stockings, or like how exactly, were they knitting or the nail botting? Don't quite know because we haven't found a 17th century mitten here, so we can't tell for sure. So I just mentioned this. This is just kind of like a summary of some of the things I talked about.
Now bound.
So you take a needle, it's a thick needle, and you have a string on it, a length of string. And you make a loop, you pull it through, and you make a knot. And then you link the knot and knot and knot around just like you would knitting until you form a mitten. There are people with videos online that you can actually watch them make these things. It's become Viking era products. Knitwear and wadmal is becoming very popular, and people are trying to reproduce it. So you can actually watch people do this historic style of weaving. You can watch them nail bomb. You can watch them knit. There's a really good, it's not an expensive book, but it's on Scandinavian knitting. But she goes through the history, which is really great, including some of the exports. Unfortunately, I didn't have the other photos, but this one's also in the Reykjavik Museum. You can actually see the lines, and that's from the twill when they sew it. This was interesting. Native Americans really liked the stuff too. And so when they purchased various different tracts of land, they requested things like wadmal and stockings to be included in the transfer. There's one thing I will add is that in my original presentation, there was one more section on axes and ironware. There was a lot of pots and axes that were being shipped down. And over time, the Mid-Atlantic will develop their own axes. But if you take the examples of really early broad blade axes from like the Delaware region, and you compare them to the old Viking ones, you're like, whoa, you know, that's a nice mix. And so it would be interesting, because a lot of times they have a neck on them, and not a lot of axes from England don't. And so it would be interesting that if somebody that specializes in ironworks and things like that actually did a study to see if the Mid-Atlantic axes really are an evolution from the Viking era axes, because they're not shaped like English axes. So does anyone have any questions?
Can you talk about the Swedes in Delaware?
Yes.
The colony in Delaware.
Yes. So I'll talk about it a little bit in general. Does everyone know there was a colony called New Sweden? So first the Dutch were there, and then what happened was the Swedish people came in and they set up a colony there. And it wasn't like a huge colony, but there was mostly plantation farmers, and it was not wealthy. It was like subsistence farming in many ways. But they came from a variety of Scandinavian and Nordic regions. They imported things like copper kettles, axes, hoes, anything that's in the iron and copper, they imported. They were making shipments out of New Amsterdam. The Dutch were more than willing to help them sustain themselves. They didn't want it to collapse because they needed people and they wanted to get that area back. But they were importing wadmal. They were importing knitwear directly from Scandinavian countries, and they were importing stuff through the Dutch. And what's funny is when they put in an order with the Dutch, they were asking for the Scandinavian products. So they seemed to be they wanted to sustain their culture. And from what I understand, and from some eyewitness accounts, throughout the 17th century, if someone, say, wanted to portray them, it would be wrong. Actually, it would not be, according to primary sources, you would not want to portray them as in the English fashion or in a general continental way. It really should be very Scandinavian in garb and in lifestyle. From what I understand, there was a couple accounts where, because there was a lot of Finnish people there, they were called woodland Finns, they were dressing in wadmal. They would dress with the Icelandic stockings, but their breeches and their doublets or their skirts would have been made out of leather, which is not typical, especially skirts, petticoats made out of leather. But what it was is they didn't have any way to manufacture their own fabric. And many of the fabrics that the Dutch had were too expensive. But the Dutch would often subsidize. The Dutch were notorious for subsidizing, let's put it this way. In New Netherlands, they subsidized beer because they believed everyone had the right to beer. So that's the life they had. It really is a really cool life. So you would have been clad in leather. Your axes would have been more of a Scandinavian style with the neck on it. The reason why they had the neck is because when they're hacking down those trees, it's less likely to break because they were very conscientious of cost because they just didn't have money and they were exporting tobacco as best they could and trading with the Native Americans. So from what I understand, the leathers that they used were pretty much anything they can get their hands on. They exported a lot too. But elk was we had a lot of elk at one time, and elk breeches were like the thing. Like if you had a pair of elk breeches, you're like, wealthy. Elk was popular, buckskin was popular, and then any sort of furs that you can get your hands on. So I mean, you're talking a very Scandinavian, like woodland type of a person there. I'm not sure, wait, how are we on time? There's something really, I almost said cool, but it's sad, actually, what happened, but amazing. So when the English came, General Carr came to New Amsterdam to take control, he eventually had to go down to New Sweden area. And the Dutch decided not to fight because they'd rather keep their economic lines and warehouses intact. Because if those went up in flames, their money and resources went up in flames. But the Scandies down in the Delaware didn't have that. All they had was their land, and they were scared the English would take it from them. So what ended up happening was, I believe they fought for 2 days, 2 to 3 days. They held off General Carr. Now, General Carr had ships, he had cannons, he had guns. I mean, like, he had pikes. And here you have these woodland Finns, and they had their axes. If you look at their inventories, they don't have guns. I mean, like, you would see something, a shipment, 3 muskets. I mean, it's like, what is anyone gonna do with that? They're just gonna go shoot, some elk. But, you have these, like, if something like, a couple hundred people down there. So you have these people defending themselves with a few muskets, a couple blunderbusses, which are these, like, things that don't shoot straight, and axes and hoes, and they held them off for 2 days. And General Carr trapped 40 of them, went down to Virginia, and sold them into slavery. They were Finns, they were Nordic people, and they were also some Dutch people that were in the soldier. Anyone that fought him, he went down there. And there's 2 primary sources that reference this. One of them is a Dutch merchant who goes, oh yeah, remember when General Carr took these people and sold them into slavery. So some of them were indentured, but some of them it was really slavery. And so Virginia actually had, slavery at that time was not very race-oriented. Like, you could have people from Madagascar. They didn't really care where you came from. We needed one, you're a slave. It's kind of how it was down there. So, but yeah, those Finns held up. I mean, could you imagine there's broad axes, and the broad axes, after you use one of those regular axes to knock down that tree, the broad axe is used to make those big timber. Can you imagine one of those things coming at you? And they have these bends in them. And the reason why the bends are in them is so you can have 2 hands and you get this, it's like a Japanese katana. I don't know if you guys ever did martial arts, but it's like, that stuff slice. So, I mean, I can only imagine these Finns coming at these English people with these axes, because they had so many of them. That and copper kettles, so you're gonna get whacked with something. But yeah, must have been amazing fighters. But that's the Viking in them, right? I mean, because the Dutch couldn't have, no, I hope no one's Dutch, but I love the Dutch, but I don't think they could have done that. Their lives were too comfortable for that. Whereas, those Finns, they were sent there for a reason. They could really hold up. I'm sorry, that was a long answer.
I know the year 1000, Iceland prohibited their horses from coming in and out of the country.
Okay.
Did the same provision apply to the sheep? Did they ever try bringing the sheep into the country?
You know what, I don't know. I know textile sheep made it there. I know Icelandic sheep are related to, I've been looking to see if anyone from Iceland or places that actually immigrated into New Netherlands. That wouldn't be surprising to me, especially if there were sailors, but it was very hard for New Netherlands to keep track of all the sailors, because they talk about this. They're like, we're getting all these sailors. And most of the sailors you see are from, like, Norway. They usually pick the sailors from not wealthy areas, so I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't have any evidence. This is actually like an ongoing project as I dig more stuff up.
Could you talk about the Vikings in Newfoundland?
Newfoundland, I'm a little limited there, but from what I understand, in the settlement that they had, it wasn't very long. It was not I don't know the exact time frame, but it wasn't very long. But I do know they had smithing there, because they did find a smithing stone. It's when they put the stone in where the heating happens. Eventually the thing will crack, and it cracks only in a certain way. So they know metallurgy was taking place there, but I don't have any evidence that any sort of metal products or products from Newfoundland, other than the cod, is being shipped down to New Netherlands. if that makes sense.
How long were they in Newfoundland?
I don't know offhand. It might have only been like 100 years. It was very,
Couple of hundred.
it might have been only 100. It wasn't very long, but long enough for them to, you know, have the village, have smithing, have farming. But it wasn't very long. I'm not sure exactly why, and I don't think right now the archaeologists know why exactly it stopped.
I think actually, there was one theory that they were driven
By the
had
Native
some bad
Americans?
relations with
That's
the
what I was
natives.
thinking. The Native Americans up that way are a lot like the Mohawks. They will fight rather than trade. So that's from what I understand.
Wasn't there also climate change that created you talked earlier about the green of Greenland, and that changed at some point and it became an ice age?
The little mini ice age happened between about 1600, 1650, depending on who you ask, to about 1850. And that heavily influenced, you know, traveling, settling patterns, because it was cold, you know, rivers that don't normally ice over in Europe iced over. So it got so cold that in areas where the little bays are off the Hudson, they would go play golf on the ice.
Were there many orders from Long Island settlements?
Were there what?
Orders for goods.
You know what? One thing I've consistently seen over and over again, if you cut Long Island in half and you had this side, they really did not like the rest of the colony. And so they had very strong ties to England and the two counties that are out there. There's actually an Englishman that comments on the people of Long Island out that way are the only good English people. They're the only ones following the English fashion, and the rest of the colony can pretty much go to, yeah. They're the only good Englishmen. Everyone else is too Dutch. And when they say Dutch, they don't mean, over time there wasn't as many Dutch people, but we had so many Germans and French and everyone else coming over. Everyone else was following continental ways. So it was really popular. So, I mean, there was English things, like English salt cellars you will see, and servettes and things like that, but it was too mixed. You know, English people would make comments that they weren't English enough.
When you talk about Vikings in New York and Delaware, what kind of ships were they using? Were they using the traditional?
They would have used, some of the ships, when it was New Sweden, they were coming in on Nordic ships from like Sweden and Norway. They would have been ships.
Were these oared ships?
I don't know offhand, but I will probably at some point do a post, now that you bring it up. But they did have, I believe they did have a shipwright down there. And so if it was a shipwright from a Scandinavian country, they would have made them in the Scandinavian ways. The Dutch did not believe in controlling how people made things. They're like, is it cost effective? Great, you know, we'll go with it, you know. So any windmills that were being built by them would have been in a Scandinavian fashion. I can't see the time.
I just have one more
Oh, go ahead.
question. In this area around Boston, there are monuments dedicated to the Vikings who came here,
Oh,
okay, which didn't happen, I gather.
no, I have no evidence of that.
Okay. All right.
So this is really,
Can you talk a little bit about that experience in Boston when people thought that the Vikings landed on the Charles River?
I don't know a lot about it. Most of the things I've seen referencing that type of thing is like, you know, someone planted evidence type of stuff. For me, you know, it's like, you know, I've been to China and Japan and places like that. When you go there and you see these isolated little communities and you see how certain things have survived through the centuries and then it gets imported, like, so for instance, there's a Japanese katana in one of the inventories. There's Japanese kimonos in the inventories in New York, in 17th century New York. I mean, when they bring stuff in, they really want the original stuff. So that's, you know, their world.
Are you referring to the Leif Erikson statue?
But also there's a monument in Newton that was built by this wealthy New Englander to commemorate the fact that the Vikings that came up the Charles River.
I'll have to
And
look
if you
at it.
haven't seen that monument, it's about 60 to 70 feet tall. You used to be able to climb to the top, but now you cannot.
Okay, I'll have to check it out.
But
Yeah.
there is the Leif Erikson statue
Yeah,
on Commonwealth Avenue.
right, I forgot that, it's been a long time since I've looked at it, but there's a note as to who dedicated it,
Yeah.
so.
I think that also the whole point of that statue too is the way that Viking is all the way back to Sweden.
Yeah.
Oh, really? I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
that's the reason why they built it.
Not Sweden, but then Norway.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's looking on the back. I
yeah.
think that was the whole reason why it was dedicated, is that he's looking back to his original place.
Yeah, there was a monument in Cambridge for a long while, too,
Really?
claiming the same sort of thing.
Early New York would have been really interesting because when you go through the inventories, you're like, wow, this person didn't come here and become Dutch or come here. You see, this person is obviously Norwegian. This person is, well, he wasn't Turkish, but he had an entire Turkish outfit. You know what I mean? And it's just these people, when they walked around, they're like, that's cool, I'm wearing that. And plus there was such a variety of immigrants. So a lot of people don't realize that about 300 Italians came in 1646, I believe it is, to New York. But they don't realize it because they were Protestant and labeled as Waldensian, but they were from the Piedmont in Italy and spoke Italian. So sometimes things end up getting, it's for the Dutch, it was the fact that they were Protestant. So when they say, oh, the Protestants from Italy, you got to be careful how you read things because they really were Italian. So
To look at these old Dutch records of New York,
Mhm.
New Amsterdam,
mhm,
do you have to know the old Dutch to translate them?
yeah.
And do you know that?
No, I mean, I do and I don't. I had to teach myself how to. I go from the word directly into English. I can't, I couldn't read it aloud, if that makes sense. It would sound, there's some strange, when you read a word in Dutch, they use the two vowels go walking type of spellings. So there's always two vowels to make something long. And the English use the E at the end. And what New Yorkers do is they begin to mush them together. So every word has two vowels with the E at the end when the English take over. It's really cute, but you start to see, odd things in there too.
Where does one find ship inventories?
So the New York Archive, New York State has in their library, if you go in their main elevator, they have all these buttons, but there's one that you
Is it
can't get
New
to.
York or in Albany?
Albany. Sorry, when I say New York, I'm from Buffalo originally, so when I say New York, I usually mean the whole province, but, or I almost said province, colony, no wait, it's a state now. But they have, you call them, let them know you're coming, they will let you, they have it all, they have all the inventories on microfiche. And if you have a stick, one of their systems lets you download them all. So, but you got, so they have the original ones in Dutch. When the English come, they don't make the Dutch switch over to Dutch because everyone spoke Dutch. And so it's not until a later general came that the king said, okay, look, we need all the court records in English. And the court records and things like that are in, the English is easy to read. But if you read what the locals are writing, it's exceedingly difficult to read. It's like ye be something, something, and it's like you need like a translator for the old English that they're using in New York. Plus, New York didn't have a lot of English people. We had Scottish people. The Scottish outnumber them like 3 to 1, roughly.
Getting back to New Sweden, what was the beginning of New Sweden? I mean, was it because the Swedish king or queen or whatever
No,
wanted
what happened was
a
is,
colony?
no, it was, I mean, they wanted to get involved, but what happened was is, I believe his name was Peter Minuit. He was one of the directors of New Netherland. He got kicked out, got PO'd, went to Sweden and said, hey, I know a spot the Dutch haven't, they only have a fort, we can take it. And so they're like, so they sailed down there And there's the fort, and the fort's like, where are you going? And they're like, we're gonna go make a colony, see ya. And they did. But the Dutch will not fire, the Dutch do not fire on people without cause. They always have to have cause to fire on people, so they let them make the colony. And as far as the Dutch were concerned, they still belonged to them. But the English, or the Swedes that were there, they're like, we're our own colony.
So Peter Minuet went to Sweden and got funding
Yeah,
to send a
exactly.
ship to Delaware.
Yeah, just to annoy the Dutch.
And how long did New Sweden last?
It wasn't long. I think it was like 40 years or something like that. It lasted until the English came. And they fell in line, you know, with so many people being taken. They struggled there for a while. It's probably what caused the massive amount of poverty that happened after that. Because before, the Dutch, you know, they're like, we're our own colony, but could you send food to the Dutch? And the Dutch are like, yeah, we'll send a shipment. You know, like whenever they needed something, they just sent it. Plus, the Queen in Christina in Sweden also shipped, you know, supplies. So between the Dutch and the Swedes, they kept them going. But the English were really poor at sending stuff.
Do you know why Peter Minuet was sent out of New Amsterdam?
I don't remember offhand. I remember thinking it was a ridiculous reason, but I don't remember what it is offhand.
I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I don't remember offhand.
Okay.
Wikipedia, I think, has a list of all the governors, and you can click on them and read each of their histories.
What year would Peter Minuet have gone to Sweden? Do you think?
Probably the 1630s.
1630s.
Yeah, yeah.
And they brought a ship with Peter Minuet leading that ship
Yes, from Sweden.
to Delaware.
Yeah, there might have been a couple ships. Yeah.
And that general who took the Finns.
General
down to-
Carr.
What's his name?
Carr, C-A-R-R, I believe it is.
C-A-R-R. Why would a general be on the ship, just out of curiosity, rather than an admiral or?
I don't know offhand. I don't know offhand. Every time I've seen a reference to him, it's always General Carr. So he was related somehow to the nobility or something like that, I believe.
Who was he related to?
The nobility, I believe.
Of England.
Yeah, somehow he's related. Any other questions? How are we on time? Okay. There's a glare on the clock, so I can't see it
I
quite.
have a final question. Is your background in textiles, is that what drove you in this direction?
I went to school for chemistry.
What?
Chemistry,
You're a chemist.
yeah.
Well, just getting to the waterproof of the tog
Mm-hmm.
wool.
Mhm.
What is it about that wool?
From what I understand, it has to do with the crimping. So the wool is crimped, and there's something very unusual about the way the sheep's wool is, from what I understand.
And it's only the outer layer.
Yes,
Yeah.
the underlayer you'd get soaked. And they refer to it as water resistant, so eventually it will start to absorb water, but there's another thing in there, they have watertight shoes, waterproof shoes. I saw this a few times, and they're being shipped in, and so that's probably also related to the Norwegians, from what I understand, but I need more evidence.
And how long did the settlement in Greenland last? Because we've heard about the global warming, and we know that it was called Greenland because at one time it was greener.
Yeah, I
How
don't know
long did that
offhand.
last?
I'm sorry, I don't know offhand.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The way I learned it was that Greenland and Iceland were kind of a trick. Was that
Yes,
they were told that Greenland was like, hey, it's green. There's
Yes.
caribou.
Yeah,
come,
that
there's
part's
lots
true,
of
yeah.
stuff there.
yeah,
I came
they,
there and it's like, ooh, this isn't green. I shouldn't want to go to Iceland.
yeah,
According to Diamond, it was warmer.
at one time.
Jared Diamond wrote a book about it. A lot of people don't like Jared Diamond, but
I think the Greenland society did crash, what, around 1400s?
Yeah, oh, yeah, there was, I mean, both Greenland and Iceland exported goods. I see the stockings and the mittens and the wadmal being exported, but I don't think,
Society maintained.
yeah, they, you know, I mean, if you're talking, it's like splitting, you know, hairs when it comes to their level of poverty. Do you know what I mean? Like, because they were just fishermen and that's the way they lived, you know?
Yeah, I've been to Iceland, and I was writing for a week, And on the first day, I saw like little tufts, white stuff on some shrubs. And later in the day, I saw what looked like a quarter of a sheep. And it was astonishing because it really looked like about a quarter of a fleece.
Mm.
And I asked our writing guide about it, and because they didn't have any fences.
Mm-hmm.
It's very odd
Yeah.
to our eyes, and it's like, how do you what as he explained that they were
Yeah.
self-shearing sheep, if you will.
Yeah.
But that people sort of had a sense of fairness.
Yeah.
People would go gather the fleece, and
Yeah.
then they would share it out based on how many
Yeah.
sheep one had.
Yeah.
So that it really is very strange to say.
Their culture, it's like Japan, where some things have survived the centuries, but on the other hand, they're very modern. My sister did a year-long Fulbright there, and one of the comments she made was she's sitting there at one of the tables, and the woman's talking about the gnomes that live over behind the rock over there, and she goes, and she was not somebody that was ever committed. She just, some people really believe there's gnomes living over the ledge. And so they still have this very, even the way they organize their families and, things like that is still very old fashioned, I guess you could say. She claims she never saw a gnome though.
There were little houses that people had put out, and they were
Yeah.
just gorgeous.
Yeah.
For little people.
I understand why they're so happy there. Yeah.
And it was the sense of taking care
Yeah,
and
the little spirits.
good
Yeah.
luck.
Is anybody making this wadmal today?
There is somebody, I don't know her name offhand. She does have a website. She actually photographed all of her making it on a loom. And there's people that do reenacting that still use the old-fashioned looms. So if you go to one, there's like a Viking museum. You can go and walk around there.
Where?
Copenhagen, near Copenhagen. And you can go, I think it's called Brantstad. And they actually have artifacts from the Viking era, and you can walk around, not Viking era, they're not surviving houses, they're modern built, but to look old. And you can actually see people doing stuff the old-fashioned way.
Thank you.
Yes. Did you like the topic? I noticed only a couple people left during the Q&A, so. Lee Ferguson?